In the chain reactions that we discussed in the first part of this lecture, we observed that for each chain carrier consumed, exactly one new chain carrier was formed. However, in some reactions, more than one chain carrier is generated in propagation steps. This type of mechanism leads to what is called a branching chain reaction. A well-known example of a branching chain reaction is the oxyhydrogen reaction, which describes the combustion of hydrogen and oxygen to form water. Although the overall reaction equation appears simple, the detailed reaction mechanism is highly complex and not yet fully understood. The mechanism of the oxyhydrogen reaction involves a chain reaction, with key chain carriers being hydrogen, oxygen, and hydroxyl radicals. The reaction is likely initiated when a hydrogen molecule and an oxygen molecule interact with the wall of the reaction vessel, leading to the formation of two hydroxyl radicals. An example of a propagation step is the reaction of a hydroxyl radical with a hydrogen molecule, forming a hydrogen radical and a water molecule. A branching step is an elementary reaction in the chain reaction mechanism that produces more than one chain carrier. One of the branching steps in the mechanism of the oxyhydrogen reaction is the reaction of a hydrogen radical with an oxygen molecule, forming an oxygen radical and a hydroxyl radical. The oxygen radical, in turn, can react with a hydrogen molecule, forming a hydroxyl radical and a hydrogen radical. The chain reaction eventually terminates when radicals are removed from the system. This can happen through radical wall interactions where a hydrogen radical collides with the wall, forming molecular hydrogen. Alternatively, a three-body recombination reaction occurs when a hydrogen radical and an oxygen molecule react in the presence of a collision partner M, forming a hydroperoxyl radical. The collision partner M can be any molecule that participates in the reaction by carrying away excess energy, stabilizing the newly formed hydroperoxyl radical. The hydroperoxyl radical is considered relatively unreactive compared to other chain carriers. It is assumed that the hydroperoxyl radical can diffuse to the walls, where it undergoes destruction, effectively contributing to chain termination. Now I would like to talk about two types of explosions that can occur in chemical reactions: thermal explosions and chain branching explosions. A thermal explosion occurs when a highly exothermic reaction accelerates uncontrollably due to insufficient heat dissipation. In an exothermic reaction, a significant amount of heat is released. Under normal conditions, this heat is transferred away from the reaction medium. However, if the heat cannot escape, the temperature of the system rises, causing an increase in reaction rate. This, in turn, releases even more heat, further accelerating the reaction. The result is a runaway reaction that becomes catastrophically fast, leading to an explosion. Thus, a thermal explosion is caused by a self-reinforcing cycle of heat accumulation and increasing reaction rate. A chain branching explosion occurs when the number of chain carriers such as radicals, increases exponentially in the course of the reaction. In the first part of this lecture, we determined the concentration of radical intermediates using the steady-state approximation, which assumes that their concentration remains relatively constant. However, what if the concentrations of chain carriers were not constant with time? If the concentration of chain carriers decreases with time, the reaction will terminate. We know from the mechanism of the oxyhydrogen reaction that radicals, in this case, generate multiple new radicals in the chain branching steps of the reaction. What happens if the concentration of chain carriers increases with time? If the formation of new radicals outpaces their consumption, the number of active chain reactions grows exponentially with time. As a result, the reaction accelerates exponentially, leading to a chain branching explosion. A chemical system that can undergo both types of explosions is the oxyhydrogen reaction between hydrogen and oxygen. Whether an explosion occurs depends on the reaction conditions, specifically temperature and pressure. Depending on these parameters, the oxyhydrogen reaction can either remain controlled, leading to a steady reaction, or transition into an explosive regime. To understand this behavior, we examine the explosion limits for the oxyhydrogen reaction, as shown in this figure. Here, the explosive regions show the conditions under which an explosion occurs. If we fix the temperature here at 800 Kelvin and increase the pressure, we observe different behaviors. At very low pressures, the system is outside the explosive region. The reaction proceeds smoothly without an explosion. As pressure increases, the first explosion limit is reached. Above it lies a critical pressure range where a chain branching explosion is triggered. Beyond the first explosion limit, a further increase in pressure above the second explosion limit leads to a return to steady and controlled reaction behavior. If the pressure increases above the third explosion limit, the system enters another explosive regime corresponding to a thermal explosion. The probability of chain carriers' survival is a key factor that determines whether a chain branching explosion occurs. A chain branching explosion is highly dependent on the concentration of chain carriers. If the concentration of chain carriers increases significantly, the reaction is more likely to enter an explosive regime. To sustain an explosive reaction, both pressure and temperature must be favorable for propagation and multiplication of chain carriers. For a chain branching explosion to occur in the oxyhydrogen reaction, the temperature must be greater than about 730 Kelvin. At lower temperatures, the reaction rates for radical-producing steps are too slow, preventing significant chain branching. As a result, no explosion occurs at low temperatures. However, temperature alone is not sufficient for a chain branching explosion to occur. Pressure must also be high enough to sustain chain branching. At very low pressures, the system is outside the explosive region and the reaction proceeds smoothly. Chain carriers are more likely to diffuse to the vessel walls, where they become deactivated before they can significantly accelerate the reaction. This leads to chain termination and suppression of chain branching, and no explosion occurs. As pressure increases above the first explosion limit, the first explosive regime is reached. In this regime, chain carriers are more likely to participate in branching reactions before reaching the walls. This allows chain branching to exponentially increase the number of chain carriers, which leads to chain branching explosion. When the pressure exceeds the second explosion limit, the reaction returns to a controlled regime and proceeds smoothly. At these pressures, the concentration of collision partners is large compared to the concentration of chain carriers. The combination of hydrogen atoms with oxygen molecules to form relatively unreactive hydroperoxide radicals becomes more likely than the branching reactions. These long-lived hydroperoxide radicals diffuse to the walls, where they become deactivated. This leads to chain termination and suppression of the chain branching explosion. At even higher pressures above the third explosion limit, the second explosive regime is reached. In this regime, the hydroperoxide radicals are more likely to react with hydrogen molecules, forming hydrogen peroxide molecules and hydrogen radicals before they diffuse to the walls. This leads to another explosive regime, thermal explosion, caused by insufficient heat dissipation.